They erased his name from the UN speaker list, no warning, no explanation, just gone. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had traveled halfway across the world to deliver a message, and they shut the door in his face. Why? Because what he was about to reveal could collapse everything the West has built in Africa. This wasn't about protocol, it was about fear. Fear of a new Africa. What happened next shook the entire United Nations. You won't believe what Captain Traoré did in that room. Watch until the end and don't forget to like and subscribe for the truth they don't want told. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against global giants. If you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story in its own voice. If you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story belongs to you. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to take part. To walk with us through a rising wave of awakening. Because whispers are no longer whispers. They've become a silent storm, and it's already shaking the world. But back in Ouagadougou, the truth was already surfacing. A confidential emergency meeting had just concluded, and what it revealed was explosive. Intelligence officers presented leaked documents, showing that President William Ruto had met with Western diplomats weeks before the UN summit. The goal was clear: block Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech at any cost. Traoré wasn't just going to speak, he was planning to shake the global order. His announcement of a Pan-African Monetary Fund posed a direct threat to foreign control. And now the silence around him wasn't procedural, it was calculated, deliberate, and deeply political. What terrified them wasn't just Captain Ibrahim Traoré's voice, it was his vision. He wasn't coming to the UN to ask for help. He was coming to announce independence. A new financial order, an African monetary fund controlled by Africans for Africans. A continent-wide alliance to manage its own resources, free from foreign banks and backdoor deals. For decades, Africa had been told it couldn't stand alone. Traoré was ready to prove otherwise. That's why they moved against him. Because if his message reached the world, it wouldn't just inspire, it would ignite something they could never contain. So while the world assumed he'd been silenced, Captain Ibrahim Traoré quietly boarded a plane to New York. No press, no grand entrance. This time he came not as a speaker, but as a silent observer. A man who had been publicly excluded, yet privately determined to confront the very system that shut him out. What happened next was never part of the schedule. In the middle of a session on regional partnerships, President William Ruto took the floor, speaking confidently about African unity. That's when Traoré stood up, calm, composed, and direct, and requested to speak. Murmurs broke out instantly. Security looked confused. Diplomats exchanged nervous glances. It was highly irregular, but the tension in the room was electric. Then something unexpected happened. Several African delegates stood in support. The room shifted. The chair had no choice but to yield. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked to the microphone not as a scheduled speaker, but as a symbol of defiance. He wasn't there to ask for permission, he was there to reclaim his voice, and for the first time in that hall, silence meant something different. It wasn't suppression, it was anticipation. Instead of protesting or demanding explanations, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did something no one expected. He flew to New York quietly without media attention or diplomatic fanfare. Officially, he was just an observer, a silent figure in the crowd. But those who knew him understood he was never the kind to walk away from a fight that mattered. When the session opened, President William Ruto was given the floor. He spoke eloquently about regional development and African cooperation. The room listened politely until Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood. Without warning, without protocol, he formally requested the mic. The room froze. Whispers spread like wildfire. The security team paused. The chair hesitated. It was against UN procedure, but something in the air had changed. Then came a moment no one had predicted. Several African heads of state rose from their seats and backed his request, one by one. Their message was clear: Traoré must be heard. Faced with mounting pressure, the chair gave in. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, calm, measured. Every step was deliberate. He wasn't there to cause a scene, he was there to expose one. And in that moment, the whole world started holding its breath. The microphone crackled, the hall fell silent. Captain Ibrahim Traore looked around, not with anger, but with steady resolve. Then he began to speak, not in protest, not in defense, but with clarity, purpose, and weight. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He unveiled what no one was supposed to hear, a series of intelligence briefings, internal memos, and most damning of all, audio recordings, conversations between President William Ruto and Western envoys, plans to neutralize Traore's influence in exchange for economic favors. The evidence was clear, the silence that followed was louder than any speech. Diplomats shifted uncomfortably. Ruto froze. Some delegates looked stunned, others furious. "This isn't about me," Traore said calmly. "They're not afraid of Captain Ibrahim Traore. They're afraid of what we represent, a continent that no longer asks permission to exist." Those words cut through the hall like a blade. Cameras clicked, journalists scrambled. No one had expected a bombshell this precise, this controlled, this undeniable. It wasn't a speech anymore, it was a reckoning. And it left the entire assembly with a question they couldn't ignore. Which side of history are you standing on? The room didn't return to normal. Once Captain Ibrahim Traore finished speaking, the silence hung heavy, not awkward, but electric. It was the kind of stillness that follows a storm when the damage becomes visible and the truth impossible to unhear. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then came the first reaction, a slow, deliberate rise from the president of Mali. He didn't say a word. He simply stood, turned towards Traore and nodded. Others followed. The president of Chad, then Niger, then Guinea. In the span of 1 minute, over a dozen African leaders had risen to their feet in quiet but powerful solidarity. It was no longer just a speech, it had become a political earthquake. The African bloc was no longer fragmented or hesitant. Captain Ibrahim Traore had done what decades of diplomacy failed to achieve. He had unified them, not through policy, but through principle. Journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Western delegates whispered frantically. Some walked out. Others stayed wide-eyed, unsure whether to applaud or panic. On social media, the clip of Traore's revelation began spreading in real time. The hashtags #JacAfricaSpeaks and #Traore Yun Speech started trending within minutes. What was meant to be a closed-door humiliation had turned into a global spectacle. And then came the turning point. A joint statement drafted hurriedly but with unmistakable clarity was circulated among African delegations. It called for immediate reform of the United Nations structure, specifically a permanent African seat on the Security Council. The statement also demanded an investigation into political interference by foreign powers and a formal review of the procedures that led to Captain Ibrahim Traore's initial exclusion. But it didn't stop there. By the end of the day, 38 African countries had signed the declaration. The message was clear: Africa would no longer tolerate being treated as a passive participant in global affairs. The continent had voices, leaders, and dreams, and it would fight to protect them. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't linger in the spotlight. After the session ended, he left the building without comment, escorted by a modest security team. But the air had changed. Diplomats watched him go, some in admiration, others in fear. Everyone, however, understood one thing: a line had been crossed, and history had just taken a different turn. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply told the truth and dared the world to listen. Back in Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets. Flags waved, speeches echoed. For them, this wasn't just about their president. It was about a new kind of African leader, one who didn't wait for permission to lead. And that night, as the footage played on every major news outlet across the continent, one phrase was heard over and over again. Captain Ibrahim Traore spoke for all of us. From a man erased from the speakers list to the voice that shook an entire institution, Captain Ibrahim Traore's journey at the United Nations wasn't just about a speech. It was about reclaiming dignity. They tried to sideline him. They tried to reduce him to an observer. But in doing so, they gave him something far more powerful than a prepared podium. They gave him the chance to rewrite the rules live in front of the world. That day, Traoré didn't represent just Burkina Faso. He embodied the pain, the pride, and the long-buried fire of a continent too often spoken for, but rarely allowed to speak for itself. His words pierced through the silence, not because they were loud, but because they were true. And in the heart of the world's most guarded diplomatic chamber, he didn't ask for Africa to be heard, he made it impossible to ignore. The transformation that followed was swift but not superficial. In days, African capitals echoed with new energy. From Dakar to Addis Ababa, conversations shifted. Not about aid, but about autonomy. Not about representation, but about reinvention. The UN, once seen as a distant, unreachable machine, now faced a wave of pressure it could no longer dismiss. African leaders, some for the first time, began demanding permanent influence, not as guests at a global table, but as rightful architects of their own future. Yet Traoré remained quiet. He issued no victory statement, no triumphal parade. His silence wasn't retreat, it was discipline. Because he knew the battle wasn't won in one speech. It would be fought in banks, in mines, in classrooms, and in boardrooms, across every inch of a continent that deserved more than slogans. Still, something had undeniably changed. The image of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing before the United Nations, calm, fearless, defiant, became a symbol, a screenshot, a headline, a spark, and for millions of Africans watching from afar, it meant something deeply personal. It meant we are not invisible. It meant we have the right to dream and the strength to defend those dreams. It meant that our leaders can rise from among us, not above us. While the world dissected the moment, while officials debated, and commentators speculated, something deeper and far more powerful was stirring across the continent: belief. Not just belief in Captain Ibrahim Traoré, but in the greater possibility he stood for. And so, what began as a deliberate effort to silence one voice ended with 40 nations stepping forward as one. The final words he spoke still echo in the halls of history. They tried to extinguish a voice, but instead they created a symphony. If you believe that even the smallest nation can stand tall before the giants of the world, if you believe that Africa must be free to tell its story in its own voice on its own terms, if you saw the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt that same flame light up inside you, then this is no longer just his story, it's yours too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to show support, but to stand together. Because what began as whispers has become a silent storm, and it's only just begun. This story offers a profound lesson about voice agency and the quiet power of conviction. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's experience at the United Nations was not just a diplomatic incident. It was a mirror held up to the world, revealing who gets heard, who gets silenced, and who dares to speak anyway. The fact that a small, landlocked country like Burkina Faso could shake the very foundation of a global institution reminds us that influence is no longer measured by military size or economic strength, but by the courage to challenge what is broken. At its core, this is a story about dignity. Traoré was not demanding pity, nor was he chasing the approval of global powers. He stood to affirm something that had long been denied to Africa: the right to speak for itself. The reaction to his speech showed that truth has gravity. When spoken with clarity and integrity, it draws people in. It makes those who benefit from silence feel exposed, and it gives those long silent the strength to rise. The lesson is also about preparation and strategy. Traoré didn't react emotionally. He didn't protest outside the building. Instead, he entered with calm precision, waited for his moment, and delivered a message so sharp that it couldn't be ignored. His actions teach us that resistance doesn't always have to be loud, it has to be smart. Silence can be powerful when it's controlled, when it's used as a weapon of timing rather than surrender. What followed the standing ovations, the joint African declaration, the calls for UN reform, were not simply reactions to one speech. They were responses to a long history of frustration, finally finding its voice. This shows that leadership is not about charisma alone. It is about principles, about being the one who says what others are afraid to say and doing so with evidence, with integrity, and with purpose. Most importantly, this story teaches us that change often begins with isolation. Traore was removed from the agenda, abandoned by diplomatic protocol, and left without institutional support. But in choosing to act regardless, he inspired others. One voice, when consistent and grounded, can become a trigger for collective awakening. And sometimes being excluded from the stage is exactly what allows a person to create their own. In a world where power is often concentrated in elite circles, the lesson from Captain Ibrahim Traore is clear. The margins are no longer powerless. When those at the edge begin to speak, the center begins to shake. His calm defiance turned censorship into momentum and silence into a roar that resonated far beyond the UN chamber. The real takeaway is not just about Africa or diplomacy. It's about the universal truth that no system, however vast, can indefinitely suppress an idea whose time has come. And that time for Africa, for justice, for honest leadership, may be arriving faster than the world expected. I watched this video 3 times, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I needed to feel every moment again. What Captain Ibrahim Traore did at the United Nations wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was the kind of courage that you rarely see in real life. And as someone who has spent years watching my continent be spoken for, negotiated over and pushed aside, seeing one of our own stand tall and speak truth to power was something I'll never forget. I don't care what country you're from, if you come from a place that has been told it's too poor, too weak, or too divided to matter, then this story should resonate with you. Because that's what they tried to make Traore believe, that Burkina Faso was too small to shake the world, that his voice was too inconvenient to be heard, but he proved that when you speak with truth, with vision, and with unwavering conviction, even giants tremble. I wasn't just proud, I was emotional. When he revealed those documents, when he calmly exposed the backroom deals, the silence in that hall was louder than any applause. And when African leaders stood up one by one, it felt like history shifting in real time. This wasn't just about him, it was about all of us, our dignity, our future, our right to lead ourselves. For years we've been told to wait, to be patient, to play the game. But Traore showed that sometimes the only way to change the rules is to step out of the script entirely. And he did it without shouting, without grandstanding. Just quiet confidence and undeniable evidence. What struck me most is how he walked away from the spotlight afterwards. No dramatic speeches, no media parade, just the message, clean, strong, and unforgettable. That's what real leadership looks like. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to start a movement. To whoever made this video, thank you. Thank you for not letting this moment pass unnoticed. And to everyone watching, don't just like or comment, share it, talk about it, teach your kids about it. Because if this story fades into silence, then we've missed the point. Captain Ibrahim Traore reminded us that our voice matters, that Africa doesn't need permission to speak, and that silence, when used with purpose, can shake even the most powerful rooms in the world. From the bottom of my heart, I believe this was more than a speech. It was a shift, and I hope it's just the beginning. What Captain Ibrahim Traore did wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a declaration of self-worth. And not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation, every people, every voice that has been pushed to the margins of history. For too long, we have watched decisions about our lives, our resources, and our future made behind closed doors in cities far from our soil. Traore stepped into that chamber, not as a guest, but as a reminder that Africa is not a project, not a charity case, and certainly not a pawn. His actions exposed something far bigger than a procedural injustice. They exposed the quiet hypocrisy of the international system. When we speak of democracy, where was it when his right to speak was stripped? When we talk about cooperation, why are our leaders punished when they attempt to unite under a vision that doesn't involve external control? Traore asked the questions no one wanted to hear, and that more than anything is why they tried to silence him. But they failed. And in failing, they created something much more dangerous than a speech. They created a symbol, a spark, a new standard for leadership. I was especially moved by the way other African leaders responded. It's easy to talk about unity, but it's another thing entirely to act on it, when the pressure is real and the cameras are rolling. When those presidents stood up one by one, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if decades of division borders, drawn by colonial hands, suspicions, fostered by outside interests, had cracked for a brief, beautiful moment. It showed me that unity isn't a dream. It's possible, but it takes someone brave enough to go first. Captain Ibrahim Traoré went first, and now we all have a choice: follow the echo or stay silent. I also think this story teaches us a lot about how power actually works. We often think it belongs to those who hold wealth control armies or dominate global headlines. But watching Traoré stand alone in that room, without any of those things, and still turn the world's attention his way, that was power, real power, the kind that comes from authenticity, from principles, from the refusal to be bought or broken. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. You don't have to be powerful to make a difference. You just have to be brave. Brave enough to stand in the truth even when it's dangerous. Brave enough to speak when everyone expects silence. Brave enough to believe that one voice, spoken clearly, calmly, and with purpose, can ripple across an entire continent. To those watching, don't let this story be forgotten. Let it be repeated. Let it be taught. Let it be the seed of a new era. Captain Ibrahim Traoré lit the flame. Now it's up to us to keep it burning. In the days that followed, world leaders scrambled to contain the fallout. Western media outlets, initially dismissive, now found themselves forced to reckon with a narrative too compelling to ignore. They tried to reframe the event, calling it a procedural anomaly or a diplomatic deviation. But the footage told another story. The images of Captain Ibrahim Traoré standing alone, then joined by African leaders rising in unity, had already become iconic. The world could spin its narrative, but Africa had already claimed its truth. Across the continent, schools played the speech to students. Activists printed his words on banners. Local musicians began composing songs in his honor. But more than admiration, there was motion. Civil society groups called for audits of national resource contracts. Youth forums were held to discuss African economic sovereignty. Pan-African movements, once fragmented, found renewed momentum. It wasn't just the idea of unity, it was the demonstration of it. Back in New York, diplomatic corridors buzzed with unease. The African bloc, now more coordinated than ever, demanded an emergency session with the Secretary General. Their proposal was bold: restructure the UN voting system to reflect modern global demographics, grant Africa 2 permanent seats on the Security Council, and establish a committee to review Western political interference on the continent. Privately, Western diplomats lobbied fiercely to water down the resolution. But they were no longer dealing with fragmented voices. They were dealing with a coordinated front, one that had found its voice in Traoré's defiance. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned without ceremony. He declined interviews. He gave no national address. Instead, he convened a closed-door meeting with his cabinet and regional governors. The message was clear. We've opened a door. Now we must walk through it together. Over the next weeks, Burkina Faso launched a series of reforms: a national commission on transparency in foreign contracts, a scholarship program for students in African studies and diplomacy, and most significantly, the formal ratification of its role in the Pan-African Monetary Fund, with Ouagadougou proposed as one of the institution's rotating headquarters. The world watched carefully. Some skeptics dismissed it as a momentary surge of nationalist pride. But others, especially across Latin America and Southeast Asia, saw in Traoré's act a blueprint. In Bolivia, in Sri Lanka, in Haiti, student protests referenced the UN speech. If Burkina Faso can speak, so can we read one sign outside a university in Lima. Traoré had unknowingly sparked something global, a rethinking of legitimacy, of voice, of whose narratives get broadcast and whose are buried. But while movement surged, threats multiplied. Intelligence officials in West Africa intercepted coded communications suggesting possible destabilization efforts. The same powers embarrassed at the UN now considered more covert means to restore balance. There were whispers of bribery, of internal coups, of manufacturing dissent. Traoré, ever the soldier, knew what came next. He reinforced security. He moved his most trusted allies into critical positions. But most importantly, he didn't panic. He stayed grounded, returning to rural areas, holding town hall meetings, listening to the people. In a village near Bobo Dioulasso, an elder stood during one such gathering and said, "You spoke in that room for all of us. Now let us speak for you. We will not let them take you from us." That night, community watch groups spontaneously organized, not out of fear, but out of pride. And then the unexpected. A letter arrived, handwritten from the president of an island nation in the Caribbean. In it he wrote, "Dear brother Traoré, what you did reminded us all that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. We stand with you, not because you asked, but because your silence spoke louder than 1,000 speeches. In our next summit, we would be honored if you would address us as a leader of the global South." It was the first of many. Suddenly, Traoré wasn't just a West African figure, he was a voice echoing across the formerly colonized world. From the Pacific Islands to the Andes, leaders began referencing the Burkina moment, that split second when the forgotten continent reminded the world of its heartbeat. And yet through it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained unchanged. He continued living in his modest residence, refused to expand his personal security beyond what was necessary, and insisted that the international spotlight should fall not on him, but on what Africa could become when it stopped asking for validation. "We do not rise to be seen," he said in a quiet radio interview. "We rise because it is time, if the world sees us good. But even if it doesn't, we will keep rising." That humility only deepened the reverence. In one university in Senegal, a professor of political philosophy added a new required reading, the Traoré Address. In Kenya, students staged a reenactment of the UN scene, with children playing the roles of delegates, standing one by one for Africa. And in a remote school in Madagascar, a young girl wrote in her notebook, "One day I will speak like him." What began as a silencing had become 1,000 beginnings, and somewhere quietly in a room with no cameras, Captain Ibrahim Traoré began writing. Not a memoir, not a defense, but a vision, a document titled The African Horizon. He wasn't finished, not even close, because the storm he had stirred wasn't destructive, it was cleansing, and its winds were still rising.